Hi there, I'm Jeff with Werthmann-Radnich Coaching. I help small business owners with stress management and just relating to their stress better. And today I wanted to talk about scheduling and setting your schedule. As small business owners, it's complicated because it always feels like there's something coming up. We may have plans to, work on a certain project, or to work on, just how our business is running, and something comes up. Somebody calls in sick. There's an immediate issue that requires your attention. Machinery needs to be fixed. Whatever. And so, it makes it tough to set that schedule because you feel like, well, why even bother? Because something's inevitably going to come up and I won't get to that thing that I want to, and then I'm going to feel discouraged and, forget it. And, the difficulty with that is that, then we kind of fall to that lowest common denominator where we're just showing up to work. We're doing what needs to be done, but we're not making any progress. We're not really doing the things that excite us, about, why we got into business in the first place and really engaging with our business. We're just running it. So how can we help ourselves with that? And one of the best ways is just to make that schedule. And it may be at first, you're like, this is not going to work. It's the fact of giving it a try. This is how we help ourselves, is by trying new things, seeing what works for us, seeing how it works for us, seeing, how we might change it so that it might work for us. And this is one thing because, what scheduling out our day does is it puts everything in front of us that we want to get accomplished. We've got it all, right there so that we can look at our day and go, this is how I want to spend my time. Not how it might actually get spent, but this is how I want to spend my time. This is where I want my focus to be. And we start to remind ourselves, why we're doing this in the first place. And from there, it takes stress off too, because, when we just kind of leave these thoughts inside our head, like, oh, well, I want to, organize this room, or I want to organize these files today, or something like that. It's still sitting up in our head, and we're like, okay, well, I'd like to get through this, but I can't, and it causes stress. Putting it on the schedule, writing it down, gets it out there so that, we're like, okay, I don't have to think about this every 5 seconds and remind myself this is something I want to do. It's right there, and it takes that stress off. And it takes off stress too because, then we're not, sitting there with, this feeling of, what is it that I want to do with my day? And that can be a real, waste of our time when we're sitting there going, oh, I've got a few extra minutes. What did I want to do again? And, while we come up with an idea, something else comes up, or, it's time to work on, something else for our business. So it's writing out that schedule, taking a look at it, and then, adjusting it as needed. If we set up that schedule initially, and it doesn't, work out the way that we planned, we've got it all written down. We can now look at it and go, okay, what didn't work? Why didn't it work? How can I make this work, tomorrow or the next week, next month, however far out you want to plan, there's no limit. But, from there, it's like, okay, sure, making a schedule, it sounds like a great idea. How do I do it? And, of course, there are a multitude of different tools available to us. Myself, I love just writing it down. I've got my little book here, my daily planner, and, I set it right in front of me so that it's right there the entire day so that, I'm like, oh, was there something I wanted to do? Boom, it's right there. And, for me that works, for others, For you, it may be, on your phone or on a laptop, it may be on a whiteboard on the wall, just something that's immediately accessible so that, when you're in that space going, how am I spending my day? Boom, it's right there. And you don't have to like go searching for it. It's in that space, in that amount of time that, we start to drift away from our schedule and, forget about what it is that we want to do. So, having it immediate, having it tangible, writing everything down, not even just like, I want to organize that file cabinet, what else? Wake up, brush teeth. You can get really granular with this stuff. But, the point is that the more we have written down, the less we have to think about it. And the less we have to think about it, the less we're stressing, trying to remember all the things that we want to do. Or, and it also keeps us on that schedule of, boom, 7:15, I'm out the door, and, so we've set that goal for ourselves already, and when we meet that goal, it comes with that sense of accomplishment. If we don't meet it, then it's that question of, okay, why didn't we meet it? How can we help ourselves meet it again tomorrow? So, writing everything down is helpful. And I do it, not only in my business, but in my personal life as well. So that, each hour of the day, is scheduled out. Does it always work that way? No. But you make adjustments. Things come up, that's part of small business, and that's part of life. But with having that schedule immediately available, I can go, oh, okay, I didn't get to, write my newsletter, during this hour. I'm going to move that to later on in the day, or I'm going to move it to tomorrow. Boom, now it's there, it's written down, I no longer have to think about it until that time comes, that it's like, okay, it's time to do this. It also helps keep us present in the moment, keep us focused on what we're doing right now. Because that's another part of that stress, is that when we're thinking about what it is that we need to do or what it is that, we should have done, we get pulled out of the moment and, our mind starts racing with all of these thoughts that usually have nothing to do with what it is that we're doing right here in this moment, and what it is that we want to accomplish. So, again, it's adjust as needed. Write everything out. If it's not working, schedule some time at the end of the day, to evaluate how that schedule worked for you. What's good, what's bad, what can be adjusted, and go from there. And, there's a multitude of resources out there to help you. One of my favorite books is Eat That Frog by Brian Tracy. You can check that out. But there are a ton of resources that I can't think of at the moment, but a simple internet search is right there. If you're looking for resources or ideas or some way to help you, connect to setting a schedule, if you're like, I'd love to do that. I'm stressed out every day, but I don't know where to start, and what I've tried isn't working for me. Leave a message on Facebook here, or you can also email me at jeff@jwrcoaching.com. I'd love to, see what we could do to help you to move forward. The whole idea is to help you move out of that space of stress and that constant burnout to a space where you're engaged with your business, engaged with your life, and enjoying what you're doing. So with that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will catch you again next Wednesday. Take care.